We begin our story in Israel. 3 Israeli prisoners appear before a parole board represented by a judge, a criminologist, and a social worker. Before we get into the details, remember this one fact. All 3 prisoners had completed at least 2/3 of their sentence, but only one gets released. Now, with this information, you might think that this could be for a wide number of reasons. It could be related to the specific crime they committed. More severe crimes are less likely to be forgiven sooner. It could be related to bias from the board, sexism, racism, or some other form of unfair selection. However, it's none of these. A study exploring this exact event concluded that this came down to luck and timing. Not 2 words you want to hear when discussing justice. Here's how the study came to its conclusion. One prisoner's case was heard at 8:50 a.m. The other prisoner's case was heard at 15:10 p.m. And then the final prisoner's case was heard at 16:25 p.m. The only prisoner that was let off was the one seen at 8:50 a.m. Now, if this happened just the once, the event wouldn't have been flagged for any unfairness, but the study concluded otherwise. Over the course of a year, they studied over 1,100 decisions. About 1/3 of appeals were approved by the board, but the probability between approval and rejection fluctuated wildly depending on the time of the appeal. Early morning parole hearings were approved around 70% of the time. Afternoon parole hearings were approved less than 10% of the time. This is not insignificant. An approval rate so wildly different, coupled with a data set of over 1,000 events, suddenly makes it very unlikely to have been mere coincidence or correlation. This has causal origins. The researchers decided that parole hearings in the afternoon were judged by boards who think less critically about cases and so are more likely to default to the safety of a rejection, which requires less mental exertion. This phenomenon is known as ego depletion, or more intuitively, decision fatigue. Decision fatigue is a term coined by psychologist Roy Baumeister, who demonstrated that conscious effort draws partly from a limited pool of mental energy, as behavioral economist Daniel Kahneman explains in his book Thinking Fast and Slow. Baumeister's group has repeatedly found that an effort of will or self-control is tiring if you have had to force yourself to do something. You are less willing or less able to exert self-control when the next challenge comes around. Hence why we get a temporal causation of data over a year, a clear pattern between morning and afternoon, rather than a one-off correlation. And there are many examples of decision fatigue at play in our lives throughout the day, as energy is exerted on novel tasks stacked upon one another. Starting a diet which differs from what you're familiar with, overspending on spur-of-the-moment purchases, overreacting to provocation, tiring sooner on a new running route, performing poorly in cognitive tasks. The verdict seems conclusive. Decision fatigue is a real thing. Only it's not. Decision fatigue is yet another victim of the replication struggles in social science, the inability to reproduce findings over different studies at different times. This is a big problem, because the concept of decision fatigue is one of the few that was sticky enough to seep into mainstream parlance. When the self-help industry adopts a term, you know it's hit the mainstream. The problem with that also, however, is once it's out of the bag, it's that much harder to claw back in. So the replication issue of decision fatigue is now potentially a big misconception. So let's now look at what modern science might tell us about the indisputable pattern that decision making has throughout the day. If it's not decision fatigue, then what is it? With the story out of the way, we're on to part 2, science, to see what objective truths the story might highlight. But first, with an essential caveat. Science isn't broken, but it's a hell of a lot harder than we give it credit for, to paraphrase the data analysis blog 538. What does this mean? Well, humans are not rational creatures, scientists are no different. We see patterns, we unconsciously jump to conclusions, we screen data to confirm our hypotheses, and as a result struggle to replicate findings. Point is, just because I mention the word science doesn't mean you should take these studies as gospel. Lessons can be taken, but sleep with one eye open. Correlation is not causation. Read my favourite book in the world to understand more. Decision fatigue is a real phenomenon on some level. We absolutely get weighed down throughout the day with decision making, and as a result expend less energy thinking about problems later in the day compared to those sprightly mornings after splashing our face with cold water. However, it's a narrow view without integrating a bigger awareness about what's going on in the brain over a broader scale of time. Decision fatigue is like labeling a disease by a cough. It's one from many symptoms which can give a mistakenly clear picture in a snapshot, but not across time. And it can make us fall into the trap of mistaking correlation for causation. Chiefly, what we're really talking about here is willpower, a word first used in reference to moralistic concerns about substance abuse in 19th century Victorian Britain. The drunkard whose willpower and whose moral force have been conquered by degraded appetite. Willpower as a concept is intuitive, helping to explain why it's still such a staple of modern Western culture. It also helps to distinguish between behaviours we attribute to the conscious mind and those we don't. Actually a very important concept if we're to reconcile the contradictions that come with self-awareness and yet evidence that we're not actually in control of ourselves at all times. As a concept, it also speaks to the medium of the brain that we are privy to, conscious awareness. More accurately, however, willpower describes the self-control we have to put on the brakes rather than to drive behaviour. Psychotherapist Benjamin Libet introduced the term free won't, the more accurate description of willpower as being the executive conscious power we have to override the many compulsions we instinctively feel throughout the day, to eat, to regress to bad habits, and to mate, and to determine which ones we follow through on and which ones to sideline. In this context, decision fatigue becomes the point at which we can no longer concentrate on which compulsions to prevent, at which point our behaviour necessarily regresses back to blind instinct or conditioned behaviour, to eating the donut on the table, or to reverting back to the high-fat, high-sugar diet we've grown overly accustomed to over the years. To eat the donuts does not necessarily require conscious thought. In fact, the less conscious thought, the better. Now, this is interesting if we imagine that it is consciousness which represents us as identities and instinct which is our lesser selves. It makes less sense to blame ourselves when we regress as if we made the decision. It was blind, compulsive, selfish, and often juvenile instinct which made the decision. You were just not there to put on the brakes. The other problem with willpower is that it becomes a useful scapegoat. Rather than overcoming weakness, we might be liable to put it down to a lack of free will early on. Humans like certainty and explanations, and once we're satisfied with the explanation, we can begin concentrating on other things, which probably means less learning guitar and more Facebook. The issue is when our definition of free will is wrong. It means that not only do we find excuses to stop growing, it means those excuses are flawed in the first place. And that is a complete disservice to ourselves. What I'm going to share now will give you the conceptual tools to more ably stick with habits you want to develop, but it will require conditioning over time. Here's the key idea. Willpower is not a limited energy resource that impugns you from trying hard. It's actually a reflection of how the task at hand fits into your conception of how you see your core identity in the future and how you want others to see you. Companies like Apple understand this really well. One concrete example here would be the Apple Watch, a product that lacks the essential utility of the smartphone. To sell a product people don't need, they tap into aspiration, health and well-being. We see healthy people in advertisements for Apple Watch, and we see them behaving in a way that many of us aspire towards. And the reason this advertising works is because we can conflate between wearing a product and being the person who's wearing the product. Those who learn from experience, perhaps that running is a miserable pastime, aren't as likely to fall for the marketing, but if the actors meld with the prospect's aspirations of who they want to be, the product may very well be perceived as an enabler of that lifestyle. When we consider this perspective, it becomes apparent that willpower is a very narrow cog on the evolution of behaviour. Rather than willpower driving behaviour, it's aspiration driving willpower driving behaviour. What's important to understand here is that in most of us, this is implicit and not conscious. A famous experiment in the 1980s called the marshmallow experiment with Walter Mischel tested the ways in which young children would delay gratification. One at a time, children were asked whether they wanted one marshmallow now or two later if they were patient. Later on, Michel followed up with children, now adults, and learned that those who were able to delay gratification to get 2 marshmallows went on to achieve better grades and jobs. Ironically, this spurred a resurgence of activity into the study of willpower, but again, the fixation was on the conscious brain rather than the unconscious. That is, the efficiency with which someone can put on the brakes, rather than through studies in how the children implicitly saw themselves in the future. So let's now look into why exactly the present-oriented theory of willpower in decision fatigue and ego depletion doesn't hold water. The archives of studies on decision fatigue were apparently replicated dozens of times, eventually producing many best-selling books on the concept of willpower, again speaking to the mainstream resonance of the idea. But unfortunately, in 2015, a meta-analysis of those studies, including previously unpublished research, found significant publication bias and little evidence that decision fatigue is a qualified phenomenon in science. What's more, psychologists then arranged an international ego depletion experiment involving over 2,100 subjects. The results were not able to show evidence that decision fatigue is a thing. As I've said before, if our cultural definition of willpower is wrong, and that represents an entrenched belief, it means not only do we find excuses to stop growing, it means those excuses are flawed in the first place. At best, we give up on opportunities for reasons that don't hold water. At worst, it's a false belief which could cause harm to ourselves and to others. As the psychotherapist Carl Eric Fisher says in his article on the same topic, related studies have shown that beliefs about willpower strongly influence self-control. Research subjects who believe in ego depletion, that willpower is a limited resource, show diminishing self-control over the course of an experiment, while people who don't believe in ego depletion are steady throughout. And it doesn't stop there, he continues. What's more, when subjects are manipulated into believing in ego depletion through subtly biased questionnaires at the outset of a study, their performance suffers as well. Increasingly, there are more and more calls in the field of psychology from psychologists and behavioral economists alike to view free will in a broader context, specifically across time. Psychologist Kentaro Fujita, in a popular 2011 paper, urged the field to measure willpower in terms of long-term motivations, rather than the overly simplistic definition of energy. The fact is, how you view an activity, whether consciously or not, alters the amount of energy which will be applied to that task. Let's take an academic example while we're in this realm. In example 1, you are writing a dissertation for a stranger for which you'll be paid $200,000. In example 2, you are writing a dissertation for yourself which you believe will earn you a degree and a $200,000 job and possibly worldwide recognition for your work in the future. The keyword here is believe. Through the lens of decision fatigue, energy will deplete at the same rate in both examples, given the present bias of the experiment. But when you consider how long-term motivations impact the present-oriented attitude that would come with these experiments, we begin to sense a nuanced but essential change. This is extrinsic motivation versus intrinsic motivation. Motivation by money and motivation by the heart. Consider how perceived identity changes profoundly between these two scenarios. Money comes with perhaps economic security, but the job comes with accolades like a new city to move into, an inviolable social circle, award events, mutual respect from people you admire, the perfect partner, the perfect home. Okay, some of those might always be pie in the sky, but this is how the brain thinks about the future when it's thinking optimistically. It begins to miscalibrate. What we're talking about here is purpose, and it's something that people are thinking more and more about as more and more of the basic needs in life are taken care of. What's more, while it may seem a lot of people don't get it, social respect and recognition provide far more reliable well-being than material wealth, which we desensitize to very quickly. As a final thought, consider what would happen if we didn't apply this simplified concept of free will to those needing governmental assistance, to funding an endless drug war, as in America, instead of cutting social safety nets after stigmatizing the misattributed laziness of low willpower. Perhaps we begin to realize that what these people need is a future they can look forward to. The energy assigned to present tasks is in direct proportion to how meaningful that activity is to the future identity. On this point, few people would disagree that we're failing miserably. It invites the question, Does this factor into the increased complacency we're seeing in developed countries? Fewer startups, less ambition, a greater malaise and indifference? Could this be related to our opinions of the future? Let me know what you think in the comments. And some conceited people might brush off this idea with the objection that the working class have no aspirations. They don't think this hard about life and philosophy. But these opinions amount to little more than inflating the ego of the person with that opinion, and could even mask incentives that the person has against the well-being of the poor. As we've learned repeatedly throughout this episode, motivation is more about unconscious cues than conscious cues. Focusing on conscious cues throws us off the path. If someone has meaning in their future, it's implicit, and given our pre-existing framework of social debate, it seems the people we rely on happen to be the people most likely to lie to us: politicians. If there's any takeaway from this episode, it's this: we all have control over our lives to some extent, no matter how little. Consider taking it upon yourself to dismissing the idea of free will entirely. Never give up on something using the free will get out of jail card. If you decide to get a membership at the gym, make sure you know how results from the gym fit into the identity you have about your future self and how important that really is to you. Do you think about that future every day? Do you feel empowered beyond our corrupt political framework that you can realize goals and produce value to the people whom you love and respect? If it's that important to you, the present becomes unimportant, trivial almost. The present merely becomes a vehicle to that attainment. A rusty three-wheeled car that people judge but that you don't care about because that's not your world. Here's a personal anecdote. When I go for my afternoon run every day, I say 2 words after my first stride forward: I'm in. What that means is that I implicitly already know what I'm doing. I know where I'm running, I know why I'm running, and I have certainty that what I'm doing is good for my future. Saying I'm in is a commitment as unconditional as realistically possible. I run not for my present self, but for my future self. This is a radical idea, but I've discovered that without the free will concept, I've been more empowered and more effective in reaching and surpassing my goals. Running used to be a conflict of voices in my head telling me to stop and telling me to go. Now it's a quiet temple for me to begin ruminating on my next project, on my future healthy self, where anything's possible. If you enjoyed today's episode, why not consider purchasing one of the books that inspired today's show? It helps the authors who write, me who produces, and you who implements. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts below, strike a like, and if you're feeling really daring, hover over the subscribe button and see what happens.